Early morning, September the 1st, 1939. German troops cross the Polish border, and with that act of aggression they bring to an end the last hope of peace for Europe. World War II has begun. For the previous 10 years, the League of Nations have been trying to preserve the increasingly fragile peace through constant calls for world disarmament. But those calls had fallen on deaf ears as a number of nations had been invaded and overrun by Germany, Italy and Japan, the so-called Axis powers. Now it was the turn of Poland. Her allies, France and Britain, gave Germany an ultimatum to withdraw her troops. But Hitler simply ignored them, and his tanks roared across the Polish countryside. The world was stunned. There was none of that patriotic fervor which the outbreak of World War I had witnessed, not even in Germany. The horrors of that First World War were still remembered, and now there was the added fear of the massive destruction of cities from air raids. Germany had for years laid claim to parts of Poland's territory, and that was Hitler's excuse for this invasion. France and Britain alone seemed prepared to support Poland against him. Fortunately for them, Hitler's ally Mussolini, dictator of Italy, was content to stay out on the sidelines. But France and Britain had hoped for Russia's support. Instead, Russia had just recently astonished the world by signing a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, the old enemies of Stalin and his government. To make matters worse, the Russians themselves invaded Poland in the east on the pretext of historic claims to that territory. In attacking Poland, Hitler thus knew he had nothing to fear from America or Russia. But he had to move fast to take Poland before France and Britain could actively oppose him. The military answer lay in the technique of Blitzkrieg. The notion of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, had been conceived by the Germans during the 1930s and even put into limited practice during their involvement 3 years earlier in the Spanish Civil War. Blitzkrieg was based on surprise attack. Two main elements were involved. The weapon on the ground was the Panzer division of high-speed tanks, and they attacked in liaison with a dive bomber from the air. The most famous of these was the terrifying Stuka Ju-87 dive bomber. The Stuka's part was to pound away at the enemy on the ground, carving a path for the tanks to thrust in and divide the enemy troops. Those troops, once isolated, could then be quickly mopped up by the German infantry following their tanks. But there was a problem. The infantry on foot could fall too far behind their speeding tanks. Through her position at the heart of Europe, Poland had long and numerous frontiers to defend. To the east lay Russia, and in the west, Germany, while to the north was East Prussia, a part of the German Reich. There were also German forces in Slovakia to the south. The defense of such a long multinational frontier placed large demands upon the Polish army, an army relatively ill-equipped. Her air force was less than a fifth the size of Germany's and her weapons mostly obsolete. Almost within minutes of the start of the German invasion, Germany also attacked by sea, as her battleship, the Schleswig-Holstein, fired on Poland's fortress in Danzig harbour, a city which the Germans regarded historically as theirs. A main aim of the Blitzkrieg was to destroy Poland's air force as far as possible on the ground. When Polish aircraft did manage to get into the air, they fought with ferocious courage, but their air force was simply no match for the might of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. The German bombers pounded railways, roads and bridges incessantly, cutting off communications, hindering Polish troop movements everywhere. Each time the Luftwaffe softened up resistance through air attack, the German tanks moved in to encircle the Polish infantry divisions. Then, as the German infantry mopped up the isolated Polish troops, the German tanks pressed further on. These tactics rapidly resulted in large numbers of Polish prisoners of war. In spite of their courageous stand, the Poles were unable to stem the enemy advance. The Germans reached the Vistula River on the outskirts of Warsaw just 15 days later. Even now, the Poles held out, hoping that Britain and France would attack Germany itself from the west. And indeed, the French did advance a short distance into actual German territory in the neighboring Saarland. But the French generals were unwilling to push much further from the protection of the Maginot Line defenses. Meanwhile, the Polish people stood their ground against overwhelming odds. In fact, the Poles held out so successfully that the Germans were unable to take Warsaw on the ground. So they turned to their air force to soften up the resistance. The people of Warsaw now faced the horrors of aerial bombardment, which had become so terrifyingly familiar to earlier victims, such as the citizens of Guernica in Spain and the teeming populations of Shanghai and Nanking in China. But the people of Poland's capital still carried on. So far, the Germans had overrun the Polish corridor, which used to separate them from the territory of East Prussia. Now, southward from East Prussia itself, encircling German thrusts had isolated Poland's capital, while southern Poland now also faced attack from German troops in Slovakia. But the final blow came with a sudden attack in the back from Russia, as Russian troops poured across her border from the east. Poland now faced inevitable defeat. With most of the Polish forces concentrated on the other side of the country to the west against the power of Germany, the Russians met little resistance and were able to advance at great speed into Poland. Meantime, the German army swept on eastwards, almost unopposed. Within 2 days of Russia's attack, the two invading armies met at Brest-Litovsk, the historic site where they had met before during the previous World War, when Russia had signed a peace treaty with Germany. Even now, the conquest of Poland was still not final. The Germans and Russians got down to what they expected to be a simple mopping up of the Polish army's last remnants. But it was proving more difficult than they had expected. The Poles not only held out, they were fighting back. The Germans had still not been able to take Warsaw and dropped leaflets over the city demanding surrender. But the Poles ignored them, so the bombing went on. By now, all public services were destroyed. No gas, no electricity, no water, except what they could take from the river Vistula. As food supplies ran out and the danger of disease increased, the city was finally forced to surrender. And on the 27th of September, less than 1 month from the day they crossed the border, the Germans triumphantly entered Poland's capital. Some Poles escaped to France and Britain to form their own fighting units. In Paris, the Polish General Sikorski even set up a government in exile. In Poland, yet another week went by before the nation finally surrendered on October the 5th, 1939, after an unbelievably valiant struggle against two major and ruthless powers. In 1919, Poland had become an independent sovereign state. Now, a mere 20 years on, her freedom came to an end. She was now partitioned. The Germans took over in the west, the Russians occupied the eastern half of Poland. It didn't take long for the Nazis to impose their brutal tyranny over western Poland. It was the same in the east under the Russians, but the full extent of Soviet brutality wasn't realized until later, after the Germans invaded Russia. They discovered the bodies of 4,000 Polish soldiers in a mass grave at Katyn in western Russia in 1943. The Poles had been murdered and buried there by the Russians during their occupation of eastern Poland. With the defeat of Poland now behind him, Hitler was able to turn to his main aim, to attack and occupy the small neutral states of the Low Countries, and from there undertake the invasion of Germany's age-old enemy, France. His confidence was increased by the fact that France, and indeed Britain, had not been ready to provide military support for the Poles. In fact, with the fall of Poland, France had even brought her troops back home out of Germany's Saarland territory, which they had briefly invaded and occupied earlier on. With that move, the French had now retreated to the security of their Maginot Line, with its inherent psychology of defense rather than attack. Britain, for her part, was even more ill-prepared for war. She had done little to equip her army with modern weapons during 2 decades of peace, and in no position to send adequate forces to the continent, apart from a few divisions to France after declaring war on Germany. The problem with the Maginot Line was that it had been built only along France's border with Germany, to defend them against direct attack from Germany itself. But what if the Germans should be so unsporting as to overrun neutral Belgium and attack France from her undefended northern border? So, somewhat late in the day, work actually started on extending the Maginot Line westward along the Franco-Belgian border from Luxembourg towards the Channel. Fortunately for the Allies, the winter of 1939-40 was unusually bitter, and both the Allied and German armies could do little more than sit it out. In fact, the Blitzkrieg was then being called the Sitzkrieg, the period more generally known as the Phoney War. However, It provided a vital breathing space for Britain and France to hastily improve their defences. In Britain, the great evacuation of school children from the cities had been successfully carried out, and the children were well established in the countryside. Gas masks had been issued to everyone, and it was now compulsory to carry them personally everywhere. Both the Luftwaffe and Allied air forces had so far held back from bombing each other's civilian population, aware that that could be a double-edged sword. The RAF had confined its aerial sorties to attacks on military targets only, such as warships of the German fleet, and those attacks had not been very productive. As for civilian targets, the main RAF activity was the dropping of propaganda leaflets. By the end of the winter, the bitter weather had frozen practically all military activity, except perhaps at sea. The German submarines, the Untersee or U-boats, were unaffected by winter weather and were starting to take the toll on Allied shipping. In fact, in one of the first incidents of the war, on September the 3rd, a German U-boat sank the passenger liner the Athenia in mid-Atlantic, killing over 100 people on board, including 26 Americans. Britain immediately set up the convoy system and declared a total blockade of Germany. But it all took time to organize, and the Royal Navy was seriously short of escort vessels. As a result, the U-boats sank more than 100 ships before the end of the year, though these were mostly ships that were sailing outside the convoy system on their own. The U-boats sank not only merchant vessels, but also British naval ships, including the aircraft carrier Courageous and the battleship Royal Oak, in home waters at Scapa Flow near the Orkneys. The U-boat skipper Gunther Prien became an overnight hero in Germany. Because of Hitler's relatively small U-boat force, he had to use his modern surface fleet as well to attack British shipping. One of the most dramatic of the war's naval encounters took place within the first month of the war. The battleship Graf Spee was sinking British shipping in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. She was eventually located by 3 British cruisers operating from the Falkland Islands. On the 13th of December, they fought her off the Argentine coast, near the mouth of the River Plate. Although outgunned, the British ships forced her to seek refuge in neutral Montevideo harbor. Captain Hans Langsdorff, believing that a larger British force had now arrived and was waiting for him at the estuary of the Plate, scuttled his ship rather than allow her to be sunk by his enemies. A few days later, he committed suicide. This was about the only positive success that French and British arms enjoyed in 1939. The crews of 2 of the British ships, Exeter and Ajax, were fated as heroes on their return to Britain. Anglo-French attention also turned to Scandinavia before the year was out. Stalin feared that his small northern neighbour Finland, which had thrown off the yoke of Russian rule in 1919, would allow German forces in. This posed a threat to Leningrad, Russia's second city. It also endangered the vital Arctic port of Murmansk. He therefore demanded of the Finns an exchange of territory offering them a desolate Russian region in return for Finnish areas, which would secure Murmansk and Leningrad. The Finns refused. And on the 30th of November 1939, Stalin's forces attacked them. Given Finland's massive numerical inferiority in manpower and her lack of modern weapons, it should have been an easy Russian victory. Yet the Finns held out, inflicting very heavy casualties on the Russians. The fact was that Stalin's brutal purges of the 1930s had so depleted the senior ranks of the Soviet armed forces that they were now commanded by inexperienced officers. Semyon Timoshenko, one of the few senior officers to survive the purges, now took charge and attacked again in February 1940. His land offensive and Russian air attacks soon began to tell. In early March, the Finns sued for peace. They were forced to surrender the territory that the Russians had originally demanded. The result was a mass exodus of Finns from those regions. The Western Allies had wanted to help the Finns by passing troops through the port of Narvik in neutral Norway. But Narvik was vital for Germany too, since Swedish iron ore bound for Germany also passed through this port. The German Navy was also attracted by Norway's fjords as basis for its operations against Britain. Hitler therefore ordered invasion plans to be drawn up. Before his plans were completed, the British destroyer Cossack entered a Norwegian fjord in February 1940 and rescued British prisoners of war from the German prison ship Altmark, which had taken refuge there. This incident accelerated Hitler's invasion plans, and his invasion fleet set sail on April the 6th to occupy Norwegian ports before the Allies. The German fleet was spotted by an RAF aircraft the next day, and the British home fleet left port to intercept. But a sudden gale blew up and prevented the British from intercepting the German invasion fleet. On the 8th of April, the Germans began their audacious attacks on Norway, as well as Denmark, further south. They landed at a number of points on the Norwegian coast. Other forces landed in the Oslo fjord, and parachutes were used to secure Stavanger airfield. The unprepared and weak Norwegian forces could do little in the face of all these simultaneous attacks. By the afternoon of April 9th, the Germans were in complete control of all 7 Norwegian ports where they had landed that morning. For the first time in more than 200 years, the people of Norway saw an invading army parading through their capital city of Oslo. The Germans began to advance north to link up with their other landing forces. They quickly spread through the country. Small patrols occupied every strategic village. Parachute troops landed high in the mountains. Air raids on towns sent defenseless civilians fleeing in total confusion. Women and children, even able-bodied men, poured onto any available cart to get out of the city. Since the outbreak of the war, Norway had insisted on staying neutral. Now that neutrality had left them without allies, isolated and defenseless. Before the British Navy or ground troops could come to Norway's aid, the Germans had gained control of all her principal ports. But British, French and Free Polish units plunged in and made several landings along the coast. On the 10th and 12th of April, British destroyers entered Narvik fjord to attack the German warships there. During the engagement, they sank 9 German destroyers at a cost of 2 of their own. They also attacked from the air. The attack succeeded in isolating the German ground force at Narvik. The Allies landed and took the town, holding it for almost 2 months. They also took their first prisoners since the war began. But in the end, the German overwhelming superiority in the air proved to be the deciding factor. It isolated the Allied landings from further support and forced them to withdraw from their beachhead positions under terrific aerial bombardment. Against all odds, the Allies recaptured the port of Narvik, but by June 1940, they were forced to finally abandon it. Once more, German arms had proved triumphant. Back home, the German people were jubilant at the constant news of endless victories by their armed forces. But even more spectacular news was soon to greet them. So far, the struggle for Norway had in some respects been a distraction for Hitler from more important strategic aims against Britain and France. But he needed to secure his vital supplies of precious iron ore from Sweden, which would have been threatened if the Allies had controlled the Norwegian ports. His primary aim was the conquest of the Low Countries and northern France as basis for his planned onslaught against Britain. Earlier that year, the Allies had been wondering whether Hitler was turning away from the idea of invading France and possibly Britain. It seemed now that Hitler had lost the opportunity. In the words of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Hitler had missed the bus. In fact, there had been a major debate in the German camp over how the attack should be carried out. The German army in the West was organized into 3 army groups. The original plan called for Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group B in the north, with the bulk of the tanks, to make the main effort into Holland and Belgium and then sweep down the coast. Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A would support him on the southern flank. Wilhelm von Leeb's smaller Army Group C would remain on the defensive in front of the Maginot Line. Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, and more especially his chief of staff, Erich von Manstein, objected to this plan. It was too obvious and would leave a large French army intact at the end of the operation. Rather, the main thrust should be made by the army group in the center, with the aim of cutting off the northern Allied armies. Army Group B would overrun Holland and hold the Allied attention in the north. while Army Group C retained its defensive role in front of the Maginot Line. Hitler eventually agreed to this plan in mid-March, but the Norway campaign delayed its execution. The Allied decision to establish their defense in the north on an advance to the River Dele in neutral Belgium the moment the Germans attacked played into the hands of the von Manstein plan. The hilly and wooded Ardennes region of southeast Belgium, through which the main German thrust would later come, was mistakenly regarded by the Allies as impassable to tanks. The Allies labored under other disadvantages. For a start, there was the matter of Belgium's neutrality. Belgian refusal to allow British and French troops across the frontier meant that the Allies could not carry out practice maneuvers in the area where they intended to fight. The Allies, especially the British, had reinforced their armies to a higher level during the winter, but many British divisions were still ill-equipped. Communications at the top were poor, and Allied commander Maurice Gamelin was an academic rather than a fighting general. While the Allies actually had more tanks than the Germans, some 3,300 as against almost 2,600, many, like these British Matildas, were dedicated to supporting British infantry and were relatively slow-moving. The massive French Spee suffered from having a one-man turret, which meant that the occupant had to both command the tank and operate its gun at the same time. The most serious Allied weakness was that Maginot mentality, which produced a rigidity of thought ill-suited to coping with the highly fluid German Blitzkrieg. The German attack was finally mounted before dawn on the 10th of May. German aircraft attacked Belgian, Dutch and French air bases in order to destroy as much as possible of the Allied air forces on the ground. Shortly afterwards, the German ground forces crossed the frontiers of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. In the north, paratroops were used to secure vital bridges needed for the advance of von Bock's tanks. A complete division was landed on Dutch airfields and roads in order to seize other vital points. The Dutch, taking note of what happened in Norway, put obstacles on runways, and this caused heavy casualties. Nevertheless, the Dutch army with its obsolete weapons was no match for the highly tuned German war machine, and much of the country had been overrun in just 5 days. On 14th of May, the Germans demanded the surrender of the large port of Rotterdam. The Dutch hesitated, and immediately a large force of German bombers took off to attack the city. While the bombers were airborne, the Dutch surrendered Rotterdam. Unfortunately, the German bombers could not be contacted or stopped, and much of Rotterdam was needlessly destroyed. Once again, those who foresaw the results of aerial bombardment were proved right. Next day, the Dutch government capitulated. As with Holland, the Germans had to face the problem in northeast Belgium of initially tackling waterways covered by guns. The key to these defences was the fort of Eben-Emael, which was attacked by glider-borne paratroop engineers. Using hollow charge explosives and flamethrowers, they forced its surrender, much to the surprise of the Belgian High Command, who believed Eben-Emael to be impregnable. The main advance into Belgium could now get properly underway, and the Germans were soon thrusting westwards. The Belgian forces, their exhaustion growing, withdrew back towards the River Dele. Meanwhile, the best of the French and British armies had crossed into Belgium on the 10th of May to take up the positions on the River Dele. They ran into swarms of refugees coming the other way, which in fact often hindered the Allied army's progress. The Allied commander thought that the lightning tactics of Blitzkrieg could operate only over flat, open country, but nothing could be further from the truth. The Allies had believed that the well-wooded and hilly country of the Ardennes forest, with its numerous small rivers, would severely slow down the westward thrust of the speeding German tanks and troops. So they hadn't defended the area thoroughly, and the Germans met little opposition. The German tanks advanced almost unimpeded through the Ardennes, preceded by well-trained battalions of engineers. They cleared pathways for the tanks to follow. In fact, the Ardennes forest proved to be no barrier at all to the techniques of Blitzkrieg. In a mere 3 days, the Germans reached the banks of the River Meuse, infinitely faster than the French could ever have believed. Strategically, the Germans should have paused here to bring up heavy artillery before attempting to cross the river. But instead, they again relied on the now well-tried weapon, the dive bomber. They blasted the French positions across the Meuse. With feverish haste, the Germans laid a barrage across the river with anything and everything that could shoot. This tremendous concentration of firepower continued all through the night. By the following day, elite shock troops were able to get across the river. These shock troops held the bridgehead until the engineers arrived and built their own bridges. Then, without losing a minute, the main armoured force poured across these bridges for the all-important breakthrough into France and onto the first main French town of Sedan. The French now tried to use their 4 armoured divisions, one only just formed and commanded by Charles de Gaulle. These attempted to strike at the ever more exposed flanks of the Panzer thrust, but their cumbersome command and control system and poor planning meant that they were sent into battle piecemeal, and the Germans had little problem in warding them off, inflicting heavy casualties. By the 15th of May, the Allied armies were holding firm against pressure from von Bock's army group in the north. But General Gamelin now became aware of the growing threat from von Rundstedt's panzers to the south. He therefore ordered his forces to begin withdrawal from the River Delle defense position. This sudden order to withdraw dismayed the Allied troops, who felt that they had been giving a good account of themselves. It was also bewildering for the local population. The growing flood of refugees clogged roads and made the withdrawal that much more difficult. Von Rundstedt's panzer divisions continued to sweep westwards, creating more and more confusion the deeper they penetrated. Gamelin himself was now incapable of making any decisions, and on the 19th of May was replaced by Maxime Weygand. At the same time, Marshal Henri Pétain, hero of Verdun in the First World War, was made Deputy Prime Minister. Weygand tried to coordinate British and French tank attacks into the flanks of the Panzer thrust. Although the British temporarily halted some German tanks, the Allied attacks were repulsed once more. The German drive continued, but the Allied tank attacks had made the German High Command nervous. This was especially because the main body of the German infantry was falling further and further behind. The exhaustion of the German tank crews was increasing, and a temporary halt was ordered. But General Heinz Guderian, one of the prime architects of Blitzkrieg, was determined to allow the Allies no respite and pressed on once more. On the 20th of May, his tanks reached the Channel coast at the mouth of the Somme. The northern Allied armies fighting their way back were now cut off. Guderian advanced north and seized the port of Boulogne before going on to attack Calais. Here, a hastily organized British brigade had just arrived from England to reinforce the French defenders. The reinforced garrison put up stiff resistance, and there was fierce fighting for 2 days. Eventually, German superior strength told, and the defenders were forced to surrender. This left the Northern Allied armies with the German noose even tighter around their necks. They were totally cut off from the French armies in the Maginot Line and south of the River Somme. The Belgians, their country almost totally overrun, considered that further resistance was useless, and they now sought an armistice. On the 27th of May, they surrendered. The vacuum created by the surrender forced the British and French into an even smaller perimeter. Meanwhile, Lord Gort, the British commander, had decided that the evacuation of his force to England was the only option other than surrender, especially since German pressure was intense on the Allied pocket, which was based on Dunkirk. The British troops therefore began to assemble on the beaches here for what was to become known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Back in England, a large fleet of vessels ranging from destroyers through cross-channel ferries down to small pleasure craft had been hastily assembled. They began to make their way across the channel in order to take off the troops from the beaches. The evacuation began on the 27th of May. But the Germans made one mistake, which brought vital additional time for the evacuation. Hitler halted the German tanks because Hermann Goering had persuaded him to allow the Luftwaffe to finish off the Allied forces. Several vessels were sunk. RAF fighters based in southern England made it possible for the evacuation to continue. Eventually, though, with the French beaches themselves now under direct artillery fire and the sinking of ships increasing, the evacuation had to be halted on the 3rd of June. No less than 220,000 British and 120,000 French and Belgians had been rescued to enable them to fight another day. But they had to leave all their vehicles and heavy weapons behind, as well as many men who now faced a long period as prisoners of war. It had been a devastating defeat. But the Battle of France was not yet over, and there was more work to be done before the German troops could enjoy the fruits of victory. On the 5th of June, while Army Group C continued to tie down the Maginot defences, the Germans struck south across the River Somme and Aisne. As usual, the Luftwaffe prepared the ground. Initially, French resistance was fierce, and the Germans had to fight hard to break out of the bridgeheads. But soon they began to make progress. A trickle of surrendering French soon turned into a flood. The Panzer columns raced onwards with Paris now under threat. The French government declared it an open city on the 11th of June in order to avoid the devastation which had befallen Warsaw and Rotterdam. 4 days later, the Germans secured the prize which had eluded them in 1914. Parisians could only watch, stunned. On the 16th of June, the French sought an armistice. By this time, the Germans had finally begun to attack the Maginot Line, which had been encircled by the offensive from the north. The French defenders could do no more than offer token resistance. The Germans soon reduced the force. They then occupied the Maginot Line. France's impregnable bastion had fallen. The French situation had been aggravated on the 10th of June when Mussolini, who had stayed out of the conflict in spite of pressure from Hitler, declared war on Britain and France. 10 days later, expecting little or no opposition, his troops invaded southern France, but were surprised by the firm resistance they met and made little headway. Even though the British had had to evacuate their forces from France, they did try to send out another expeditionary force, this time to Cherbourg. But by the time this was organized and began to arrive at Cherbourg, it was too late, and it had to return to England. Even if it had been landed, the force was most unlikely to make any difference to the outcome. The German forces had overrun and occupied 7 European nations over a period of less than 10 months. In actual battle time, the period was less than 10 weeks. The concept of Blitzkrieg or lightning war had proved its effectiveness beyond question. Winston Churchill had taken over as Prime Minister on the 10th of May, the day the German invasion of the West began. He realized that Britain would be Hitler's next target and began to prepare accordingly. Across the English Channel on the 22nd of June 1940, the French were brought to the armistice table which was in the very same railway carriage where the Germans had been made to sign the November 1918 armistice. It was the final indignity for the French, but a moment of supreme triumph for Hitler.